What's up everyone, it's Sinistry, and today we are going to talk about Dead by Daylight's fatal flaw, its gameplay. I've been playing Dead by Daylight for a very long time. I started sometime around 2017 when Freddy came out, and I would say my favorite years were around 2019 to 2020 when I used to play a whole lot. However, right around the time that Blight came out, and definitely after Blight came out, I noticed kind of a drop off in my own interest in the game, and I kind of feel like it's been that way for a lot of the community as well. So I was thinking, what could possibly be causing people to lose interest, especially in the new DLC that we were getting? I just was trying to ponder this, and I think I came across the conclusion that it has a lot to do with the gameplay. So today I'm going to break down the gameplay to even more of a basic level, and then we're going to talk about 3 different issues related to the gameplay and some possible solutions that Behaviour could implement to make the game a lot more fun. If you like video game analysis videos like this one, make sure to like and subscribe, but now let's jump right in. Dead by Daylight's gameplay is super basic, but we all know this. You're either a killer trying to get a group of survivors before they can escape a compound, or your survivors trying to escape the compound. Add in a couple of different powers that you have as a killer, or that you need to repair generators, maybe need to heal as a survivor, and you basically have the entire game in a nutshell. However, I had a realization that I think the reason why Dead by Daylight was so fun in the first place, but also why it's kind of driving us crazy nowadays, is because it's a basic childhood game that we all grew up playing. And that game is freeze tag. So if you think about it, there are a lot of parallels. In freeze tag, you have one person who is it, and in Dead by Daylight, you have the killer. You also have a bunch of other kids being essentially the survivors in freeze tag. When it catches a player, they have to freeze in place, and when the killer catches a survivor, they get hooked where they're unable to escape. Both games require the other players to free the captured players, and the ultimate goal for both the killer and for it is to basically get everybody at the same time so that nobody is able to unhook or unfreeze another person. Another interesting comparison that I thought of is that face camping is actually a valid strategy for both games. In freeze tag, you can just watch the frozen kids to avoid them getting unfrozen, and in Dead by Daylight, you would face camp to ensure somebody gets ultimately killed. So Dead by Daylight being freeze tag is not inherently an issue. It actually is probably subconscious something we like because it's very familiar to us. However, just this concept alone has some flaws, and I think this is ultimately what Behaviour is not focusing on and why it feels like the game is getting more and more just off the rails, but not really any more interesting over time. So now let's dissect 3 different issues that are related to the gameplay essentially being freeze tag and some possible solutions for each issue. So the first issue is perks, and I think we all kind of understand perks, but just in case you don't, I'll briefly explain them. Perks are basically game enhancements that you take into a match, where you might be able to move faster, you might be able to dodge attacks, things like that. And from a killer perspective, you might be less detectable, you might be able to see where survivors are, and things of that nature. Every new killer and every new playable survivor character comes with new perks, and that's kind of an issue because there are so many perks at this point in time. However, with the vast number of perks we also have so many perks that are just literally never used unless they're used in like a meme build or for maybe a challenge. This is because the game is really difficult to balance, and so there kind of is a meta gameplay always happening behind the scenes where people tend to only pick the same like 10 or maybe 15 perks for both killer and survivor. If you actually think about Dead by Daylight as freeze tag, you'll start to kind of understand why perks are so difficult to make unique and why it's so frustrating that they just keep putting out more and more perks every time. If you were playing freeze tag with your friends, sure, you might have like an inherent perk of like you're a faster runner, so maybe you're able to avoid people more. Maybe you have a perk of getting a head start as a survivor or things like that, but there's really only so much that you can give people before it just starts feeling really like stale, like you're giving them the same kinds of perks just in a different, like, repackaged skin. Unfortunately, Behavior has kind of backed themselves into a corner with perks where they basically have made it standard that every character, every killer is going to get perks, and so people expect them every time, which obviously is causing so many issues. The biggest issues with perks are, first of all, balance. It is so hard to balance for literally like over 100 perks in a game when so many of them are very similar to each other. So if you balance for one, another one could be slightly more meta, and it's just going to shift the meta, not really get rid of it. The second issue is with unused perks. Unfortunately, with so many perks being very similar to each other, it's very difficult for Behavior to have a use case for every single one of these perks being in the game. And finally, with every DLC pack, it kind of feels like there's less bang for your buck because you're essentially promised that you'll get perks, but in reality, so many of them aren't even used. And the ones that are used in maybe the newer packs just kind of invalidate older ones that you already might have paid for. So either way, it just doesn't really feel like you're getting as much of your money's worth if you buy every single pack. Okay, so what's the solution? Well, the most immediate solution is to overhaul the perk system entirely. Get rid of like maybe half of all perks, maybe even 2/3 of all perks or more depending on how many duplicates you really have. I would have to really sit down and look at them to get a rough estimate of how many they should get rid of, but it's a lot. And they should also decouple them from characters so that way you can get perks even if you didn't buy the DLC packs. The reason for this is ultimately people will still only buy meta DLC packs if they see the benefit in them, and they won't buy the other DLC packs that have maybe worse perks or perks that they're not as interested in. Now, I can imagine Behavior saying if we decouple perks from characters, then who is going to buy the characters? What is even the point of the DLC? And I still think that there's a point in buying DLC just for killers, but if you're only a survivor main, I totally get that you might have less of an interest in buying DLC if you don't get the perks with the characters. However, I am also considering the fact that people get tired of this game, and as it becomes more and more meta and more sweaty and more difficult to just have fun on this game, people aren't buying the DLC anymore. So if you want people to buy the DLC, you should focus on making the game fun, and then people will buy the skins. People want to play as different characters that they like from various franchises. It's not so much a perk being the biggest benefit of the DLC, it's getting to play as the characters and play a game that's actually fun. So these are things that Behavior can do today. I mean, they obviously would take some time to do these things, but these are things that they can work on starting right now, and they can have a long-lasting impact. But long term, Behavior would also have to make some changes in how they address adding new perks. Basically, Behavior should really focus on not adding any new perks unless it is actually related to some kind of gameplay feature that's added or changed within the game that might kind of warrant new perks being added to the game. Otherwise, again, you're just gonna have 700 of the same perks, and it's going to be super boring because people only choose the same 10 of them anyway, and you have to scroll through the whole menu to find the ones that you like. It just becomes kind of annoying. And I think that if they just limited their scope, they'll have better balancing, they'll have better just kind of like cohesion in their games. You'll be able to see people playing better, I think, because they don't have to just choose like the most meta perks. They're just choosing perks for more so like the type of role they want to play on the game, rather than like, okay, how can I be the most sweaty gen rusher? How can I be the most sweaty healer or whatever? They can just focus on, okay, I want to play healer, so I'm just going to choose the healing perks, things like that. And ultimately, they should also focus on refining the perks. The perks as they are probably would need to be totally overhauled if this were to happen, which would be totally fine. They can just take the best pieces from the different perks that they like, have some advantages, disadvantages. Again, like I said, you could probably have maybe 2 or at most 3 perks for every kind of benefit that you get from the perk, but they need to have unique disadvantages as well. And it really needs to be like worthwhile to take this perk. It can't just be like, oh, you have 3 perks that give you a speed boost, but only one of them has a reasonable disadvantage, so we're only going to take one. No, you need to actually have them balanced as well. And ultimately, perks need to not be seen as a solution for poor balancing. The balancing in the game needs to be separate from the perks, and then like the perks need to be made with balance in mind, meaning like the perks should work with the balance, but the balance should be its own thing that is not related to perks. You should not have to take specific perks perks in order to win the game. Either way, I think I've pretty much exhausted the issue of perks, so let's move on to the next issue. Now, the second issue is related to killers and specifically their abilities. Now, the killers' abilities vary so much, so it's not the same kind of issue as perks. I mean, there's a little bit of overlap, but honestly, most of the killers are quite unique. However, the issue lies in how many of the killers would just be either considered way too OP or just not even really fitting with the theme of freeze tag. What I mean by this is if you think of a lot of the older killers, they kind of fit in with the mood of freeze tag. Like, you could have traps laid out for people, even if they're just make-believe traps, on the playground, just like you would with Trapper. You could maybe shoot people from across the playground with a Nerf gun, just like you would shoot people as Deathslinger, and you could also have people close their eyes for a certain amount of time if you make a particular noise, just like you would go invisible as Wraith. So there's so many different like older killers that kind of fit with the vibe of playing on a playground in freeze tag. It's very simple. The abilities are not too extravagant. It's not, you know, somehow devolving into like Warrior Cats RP. I personally never played Warrior Cats on the playground, but I did play similar games where you're like a goddess and you have like lightning abilities and you can like smite everybody or things like that. And I think we can all understand that even if we didn't play these games just quickly evolve into like who can have the most OP abilities and not really like an actual game that has a goal and a function to it. And honestly, that's how Dead by Daylight feels sometimes, especially when you're going against killers that just have like off the wall kinds of abilities. Think about characters like the Knight or like the Twins. Like, these things are not realistic in real life. I mean, twins, you could like argue if you have actual real life twins, but it would totally be seen as OP if you were playing freeze tag and there were two people who were it. It would just feel totally unbalanced by the actual nature of what it is. And I get that that's not exactly how Twins works, but it's kind of how Knight works, and it's kind of how some other characters work. And personally, there are just a lot of different things with the later characters that feel so much like, how can I just get the most OP ability to wipe out everybody else, rather than like, how can I just be good at this very simple game? Ultimately, there are actually a few different issues though with killers. It's not just the OP thing, but I will just once again reiterate that is an issue. Characters who are too OP or who just have like very gimmicky abilities that feel like they're very shoehorned in. These are just characters that don't really seem to fit super well with Dead by Daylight, in my opinion. They might have cool designs, they might have cool lore, they might be really fun to play as, but playing against them often is just frustrating, and I think it's actually making balance a lot more difficult as well. Lack of originality is also a big issue, and I think y'all can see that. I don't think I need to run through every iteration of killers being too similar to another killer, but I mean, you can even see that in the older killers. So many of them are just like run up to someone and use the knife. They're just too similar sometimes. And again, it kind of feels like they're being shoehorned in. But really the biggest issue is when they break the gameplay, when there are either huge bugs with killers or just kind of exploits that people can take advantage of that makes the game not fun for survivors, or when they drastically shift the dynamic of killers versus survivors. It just becomes super unfair as a survivor when you have to like wait through the whole period of time in which everything has changed in order to make it fair. And again, we have like 700 perks, and so all of those have to be changed as well. The abilities all have to be tweaked, and the speeds and all this different stuff. It just becomes like a hot mess for behavior to have to fix. I can't even possibly imagine unraveling it as someone who knows a little bit about software engineering now. It's got to be a huge pain. So I think that honestly, this is an issue that would not only benefit the users, the players, to actually have resolved, but it would also benefit behavior as well, because they would have a lot less to unravel if things weren't so drastically changing every single time a new killer came out. So ultimately, the solutions for this are kind of tough, because you don't really want to just say get rid of killers, because obviously they're playable characters, people paid money for them. It would just feel really bad if that happened. So I think that behavior needs to maybe think of ways that they can better fit them into a freeze tag style game, and not just like shoehorn them into this horror game that is suddenly becoming like too many things, but also not enough interesting things, not enough diverse things with gameplay. And ultimately they can kind of go back to their roots. They can just think of, okay, if I was on a playground playing freeze tag, how can I make this killer work so that it doesn't somehow feel like I'm devolving into Warrior Cat's RP and all of a sudden everybody's going to be complaining about how they don't have the most OP power. And likewise, they need to do the same thing when they add new killers in. They need to really think about, okay, if I add a new killer, what is it actually adding to the game? Not how can I fit the game around this killer? How can the killer work into this game? I have another solution in the next section as well, so let's jump into the final issue. I think we can all agree that the biggest issue in Dead by Daylight is a lack of innovation specifically around their gameplay. Now, when I say innovation, I don't necessarily mean that they need to change the core components of a Dead by Daylight match, but what I more so mean is that they should really consider how they can expand beyond what they currently have, maybe adding in more features to matches, maybe adding different types of matches, things like that, because honestly, we're running into a couple of issues that just seem to never really be resolved. The biggest issue that I see is just that the gameplay is super stale. If you're a survivor and you're just logging on, all you're doing is clicking a couple of buttons, and it's really not that interesting. I mean, even running away from killers, it's entertaining a little bit, but it just gets so stale and it just feels really demeaning when you go against someone who's super sweaty and you just get immediately KO'd, or if you're a killer and you have all these sweaty survivors who can get out in like 2 minutes. It's just really like the gameplay is catering to the audience who has no life outside of Dead by Daylight. And I'm not trying to make fun of people who literally only play Dead by Daylight. I get what it's like to just really love one game and only play it for months at a time. I did that with Dead by Daylight. It's a really fun and engaging game for a period of time, but I'm just saying that like if you're one of those people who only plays this game, you're obviously going to be so much better at the game than someone who barely plays it. And I just don't understand why it seems like as a basically new player, or as a player who hasn't played in a really long time, you're just not ever going to have a fun match because there's constantly people in the game who are just really, really good at it. I could kind of go on and on about this, but a lot of it really does have to do with the meta, with certain perks being very OP, with certain abilities for killers being very OP, with people who just constantly play this game, who spend so much more attention, honestly, on what's going to get them a win rather than just like interesting perk combinations or interesting play styles. And the game really doesn't provide a lot of opportunities to play it in different ways. You're basically only doing like 2 or maybe 3 things in a single match. So honestly, there's only so much that you can try to like do something different. Every game just kind of turns out to be the same. So what's the solution to this gameplay issue? Personally, I think that for public matches, there need to be at all times 3 different types of public matches that each have their own goal, each have their own function, each have different things for the killers and the survivors to do. It shouldn't just be that the survivors go and they have to click a button on something else. And it shouldn't just be that killers just have to chase survivors around in every single game type and the survivors are just doing different things. It needs to be different for both types of players. You could even really make it so that there's a survivor only type of game or a killer only type of game or something like that. But either way, there just needs to be at least 3 different types of public matches that you can play at any given time. This will make it so much more interesting than just only being able to play this one type of game. And additionally, private matches should have total customization. You should be able to limit only to certain perks. You should be able to limit to only certain kinds of killers, or, you know, whatever you want to do really. You should be able to say you have to get 100 generators to get out, but you get to play with a group of 10. I don't know. You should just be able to do a bunch of different types of things to make the game a lot more interesting, because right now, even in private matches, it's not really all that different from a public match. Ultimately, these solutions would really ensure that there's not as much of a meta with perks. So if you can't, you know, overhaul the whole perk system, then this is at least a good compromise. You could maybe use certain perks in certain types of matches, other perks in other types of matches, gives people a reason to buy all the DLC. Same kind of thing with killer abilities too. Some of the killer abilities that are like really weird for the main gameplay, you could have those killers be primarily good in like other types of matches, things like that. I know it's not going to totally resolve the issue. I know that this is kind of like a band-aid solution, but if you do this stuff in conjunction with the solutions that I had in my other two sections, you'll have a much better game. You'll have more people getting engaged. You'll have more people buying DLC. You'll just ultimately have a lot more good energy around this game. People are going to enjoy it a lot more. People are going to buy it more. People are going to play it for longer. Ultimately, I really see no downside. I shouldn't say that. There's probably downsides, but I don't personally see a downside at this moment of making these changes other than maybe potentially a money issue for behavior. Now, all that being said, I just want to say again, I do really like Dead by Daylight. I haven't been playing it for the past like year or two a whole lot because I just kind of found it to get quite boring, and I'm not super interested in the new killers, and I don't really like playing Survivor without a full group, which I don't really have. So personally, I don't know that I'm going to be playing Dead by Daylight a whole lot unless they start making larger changes over there at behavior. But regardless, you know, I think that this game is still going to have some longevity. I think it'll still be good for a few more years, and maybe there will end up being a Dead by Daylight 2 that is basically the first game, but maybe they take some of this advice and maybe they can like work it into a new game from scratch. I could see how that would work, and I think that would be pretty fair as well. So I guess we'll just have to see what behavior does in the future, and if any of these changes are implemented, or if any of them are at least considered. Maybe some of the new killers will not be so shoehorned in. Maybe we won't get as many perks, or a lot of perks will get dropped. Who knows? But ultimately, we'll just have to see what time gives us in the future. Definitely let me know if you agree with these takes, if you agree that Dead by Daylight's gameplay is kind of its fatal flaw. If you even see Dead by Daylight as freeze tag, I would really love to know, so definitely leave me a comment. And also make sure to like and subscribe if you like this video and if you want to see more video game analysis. But with that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.